See, this is why we have safe words. Hello and welcome to RotD Review of the Day, and today I am taking a look at the 2017 Netflix exclusive movie, Gerald's Game. Now, I remember 20 years ago or so, having read this book. I went on a big Stephen King kick when I was a late teenager, and honestly, it never really left me. I still love his works. But when I heard that they were making a movie about this book, I was very, very concerned. I was very puzzled, but also concerned. I only remembered the broad strokes of the book. It had been 20 years, and I remembered the basic main premise, something about a dog, and that's about it. But I also remember the broad strokes of the fact that the entirety of the book, for the most part, was one character who was very physically restrained. That was the point of it, and had to do with inner monologue, a lot of thinking to herself, and kind of voiceover of that, trying to get herself out of it, and having kind of herself and the voice of a friend, that she was kind of recalling that personality, that strong personality, to kind of butt heads with one another and ultimately get her out and get her surviving. So when I heard that they were making it to a movie, I was just kind of, well, how are they going to do this? And one thing about Stephen King is his works rarely get put to film well. And that's not necessarily, although sometimes, but not necessarily the fault of filmmakers. And I'm not going to say it's the fault of Stephen King. I think just ultimately what it winds up being is he writes his books to be books. He doesn't write them to be movie adaptations, with the exception of Rose Red, which was specifically written to be a miniseries. So you naturally kind of get that, not always going to be put to film well. I mean, for example, Dolores Claiborne, they made a movie out of that with Kathy Bates. But the entirety of that book was one character's dialogue. There wasn't a single non-dialogue piece in that book, if I recall correctly. And I've never actually seen the movie. Maybe I will. I don't know if it falls into the category of horror necessarily and whether it would actually wind up in this channel, but maybe. I'll look into that. But regardless, he doesn't write his books to be film adaptations, and I'm looking at you, late career Michael Crichton, but he writes them to be strictly his books, and they get popular, and they want to make movies out of them, and, so they try. And this one was an example of how in the world are they going to pull this off. And to describe how they pull it off, I'm going to get into the categories. So as always, 4 different categories, each one worth up to 25 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And the plot of this one follows thusly. A woman and a man are attempting to kind of jumpstart a bit of a stalled marriage and go to a remote cabin and generally be alone for a little bit of a romp and reconnection. And in him attempting to live out his fantasies and kind of, rekindle something, they end up with a sex game, and he handcuffs her to a very sturdy, solid bed. And when she, she complies, but ultimately is not feeling it, and the situation turns a little bit hostile. And there's an argument, while she's in that vulnerable position, and he winds up having a heart attack and dying, leaving her handcuffed to a bed in a remote cabin on a lake, and needing to get out of that situation. Nobody's coming to check on her, and this is very survivalist. And if you just kind of take that for, well, okay, that sets the stage, but how do you make an hour and a half long movie out of it? And how do you make a compelling, good movie out of it? And they really, really nailed it. They adapted the book really well insofar as they kept true to the spirit of it, but they adapted and changed things that needed to be changed for the sake of the film, but still made perfect sense within the context of the story. I thought what they did to bring the inner monologue outward and visually compelling was brilliant. And I'm not going to get into spoilers on that. I will be having a deep dive spoiler-filled discussion for this one accompanying this video, so please look for that. If you've seen the movie, if you don't mind it being spoiled, I invite you to watch that. I'm going to be covering a variety of topics with that. But overall, I gave the plot 22 out of 25 points. Very, very, very solid. The intent, the intention of this was to adapt a Stephen King novel and overall deliver a movie that I believe it wasn't trying to necessarily be, balls to the wall scary, but have disturbing moments in it, have a suspense movie that had compelling characters, and be emotionally and physically visceral. And on those notes, with what they did with the character, that was very true to the book, and I was worried that there was an element of it that they were going to water down, and they didn't, and I'm glad. Because I think it packed in a very emotional, powerful punch and was almost through the kind of reflective looking glass of the character an essential part of what made this compelling and what put her in the situation in the first place. I thought they delivered very, very well. What they intended to do, they did, and I gave that 23 out of 25 points. The acting was amazing. Carla Gugino did an amazing, wonderful, just sublime performance as Jessie, the main character. It was, I imagine, to be an incredibly difficult role. Physically, emotionally, I imagine that, in delivering the performance that she did, it had to have been a very difficult time for her, and I applaud everything that she did. Also, Bruce Greenwood. I loved him, and I was very interested in seeing how he would play the titular character of Gerald, and he did an amazing job in that as well. And there were certain elements of his performance that had to be, without spoiling anything, had to be kind of given a multiple point of view, sort of hopping from one foot to the other, and I thought he performed that very, very well. I'll be covering a little more of that in the deep dive. Henry Thomas, who you might remember as Elliot from E.T., he is in this movie in a very disturbing, very difficult role, and he plays it really well. Not just the disturbing part, but there is an element of that performance that I'll be covering in the deep dive again, but it was very, very subtle and brilliant, and it was a quality piece of writing that was met with a quality performance. So kudos all around. I gave the acting 22 out of 25 points. Very, very solid. The technical, this was, I think, I'm going to include in the technical the fact that they had to adapt the Stephen King novel, the fact that they had to work the script and change things enough so that it was visually compelling and cinematic. And they did an excellent job of that. It's honestly something that I don't think I would have ever thought of in a million years. And it was just fantastic. I loved what they did with adapting this into a movie. But more than that, the effects worked really well. They were haunting. When they needed to be gruesome, they were gruesome. They just worked very, very seamlessly, and the level of detail that sometimes went into what this character had to go through was amazing. So the technical, I gave 23 out of 25 points, which gives us a total score of 90 out of 100. I thought this was a fantastic movie. Not necessarily the scariest, but a wonderful, terrible journey that was just a masterful adaptation of a Stephen King novel. And that is a really, really difficult thing to pull off. Especially, if you were to think, I'm going to take a Stephen King novel where it's one character for 95% of it, and it's inner monologue for 95% of it, and I'm going to adapt that into a visually compelling cinematic experience. That is remarkable that they did as well as they did. So major hats off to the people that made Gerald's Game and to the movie itself. I really do heartily recommend it. It is not for young children. It does have some really intense moments in it and some really uncomfortable moments in it. But it is absolutely worth watching, and I do heartily recommend it. So that should about do it for today. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.